Hi everyone. Valerie and I are on our annual break over the northern summer, and we'd hate for you to miss your weekly nerd out with us. So we visited the Nerd Vault and pulled out some of our favourite and, I think, most useful episodes. This week we revisit Season 8 when we studied conflict and cast design, and we actually analysed No Way Out in this episode. Valerie's study of cast design was fascinating. She explored Stephen Pressfield's advice about keeping the cast small and connecting them in a way that means that they can't walk away from each other. I studied conflict because behind the scenes I was making sure that my middle grade novel, Jet Cooper, included enough conflict to keep readers reading. And I was relieved that the book had plenty of conflict at different levels and for different durations. Now, one of my favourite conflict triangles in Jet is the conflict between Jet, his mum Kathy, and her younger sister, and she would say much more fun sister, Ali. The conflict between these characters was fun to write, but at times it was heartbreaking, and I was in tears writing some of the scenes. Now, my emotional connection to these characters is deep. These characters are real to me, and that's because of the complexity of their relationships. So a fun auntie, a serious and responsible elder sister, and an adored only child. And on top of this, these characters express their grief differently, which adds to their problems. The banter between Ali and Kathy is some of the best dialogue in the book as well, in my opinion, of course. Now, one of the most fascinating aspects of these characters' conflict is that their object of desire is very similar, but their conflict arises from the different ways they want to get a similar outcome. Now, to see how I've layered the external and internal conflict and incorporated Jet's character arc, you'll have to read the book, which is launching in September. So what Valerie and I learned about conflict over time and during Season 8 is included in our Story Trinity course, and we give a concise and practical explanation about conflict and how it works in the story. Some of what we cover is included in No Way Out, so listen to it again and pay attention to the external and internal conflict, each character's wants, needs, and using the other characters as antagonists or the obstacles. Now, all of this is combined with a clear understanding of what the characters stand to lose, and it gives writers fertile ground to create conflict triangles. But beware, No Way Out hasn't aged well, and it has some interesting flaws. So stay tuned and listen to what Valerie and I have to say about that in this revisited episode.
If you want to write stories your readers will love, there are 3 things you need to do. Understand storytelling principles, see how other writers have applied those principles, and then use them in your own work. Here on the Story Nerd podcast, our goal is to demystify story theory. We'll help you with the first 2 steps so that you can get started with the third. My name is Valerie Francis. I'm a writer and literary editor, and I focus on stories by, for, and about women.
And I'm Melanie Hill, writer, editor, and poet, and I have a passion for spy stories, fairy tales, and master detective novels.
On today's episode, Melanie pitched No Way Out so that we can study conflict. This 1987 film was directed by Roger Donaldson from a screenplay by Robert Garland based on the book Big Clock by Kenneth Fearing. Of course, there will be spoilers because we can't talk about the movie without talking about the movie. And if you have not seen No Way Out, there is definitely a spoiler here. So forewarned is forearmed. And please help other writers find our show by leaving us a rating and review. For Apple Podcast listeners, you can do it right from your phone. Simply go to the show's landing page, scroll to the bottom, click the 5 stars. It's that simple. All right, Melanie, what inspired going all the way back to the 1980s?
Well, it wasn't the music.
Or the cinematography.
Oh, the cinematography. No, I chose this film for a very specific reason. And that's because it has some good examples of how to create conflict. And that doesn't mean that I'm saying that this is a great movie. I don't think it's weathered well, but that doesn't mean that we can't learn from one or two good aspects of the film overall. So far this season, I've broken down the external and internal conflict by looking at each character's wants, needs, the forces of antagonism, so the obstacles, and what the characters stand to lose, so the stakes. I will do that again this episode, but this time the characters have several relationships that create what I'm calling conflict triangles. Now, there are lots of scenes with three characters who all have opposing wants, and these characters have different stakes, but their wants are in direct conflict with each other. And I think that this makes for very interesting conflict creation in the story. Now, let's look at Bryce's conflict first, because he's really the one who sets this whole thing in motion. And I'll then go on to have a look at the other main characters and the conflict triangles that they create. Now, Bryce is a political appointee who has power aspirations, and he wants to stop particular politicians from making capital acquisition decisions that he doesn't agree with. So he's the Secretary of the Department of Defense. Now, this is all interlinked to this thing that the intelligence agencies have sort of created or believe exists, is this Russian Phantom submarine. So this sort of sets up the first bit of conflict in the movie. So the conflict triangle here is between Bryce, the Secretary of the DOD, Senator Duval, and his assistant or his political aide and advisor, Marshall. Now, this conflict at this point in the movie is really centered around political power. So that's one very interesting aspect of the conflict in this movie. And this is Bryce's external conflict at the start. But he actually has more conflict in his life. So there's the interpersonal conflict between himself, Susan, and Pritchard. And Pritchard is Bryce's political advisor. Bryce wants Susan for personal gratification. And in doing this, he's actually putting his career on the line if the knowledge about his affair and Susan being his mistress becomes public. And Susan and her circle of friends who know about Bryce's affair are really the antagonists in this relationship. Now, Susan's want in this triangle, and I'm going to make some assumptions here because she's not necessarily a fully fleshed character, but her want is to live the life of a kept woman. So if she stops the relationship, she'll lose some of the carefree life that she lives, and her force of antagonism is actually Bryce's power and also Pritchard, who disapproves of her and the risk that she puts into Bryce's life. Pritchard's want in this triangle is to be the power broker for Bryce because that gives him a level of power, and it also gives him a reputation of the brains behind Bryce, which he wants to maintain. Now, if Bryce loses his power, then Pritchard loses his power too. And Bryce's mistress is a threat to Pritchard's position just as much as it's a threat to Bryce's power. So this conflict is a combination of power and physical gratification. Now, before I go on, I do just quickly want to mention that there are other conflict triangles in the story centered around relationships, and there's obviously the one between Bryce and his wife and Susan, but this doesn't feature very much, but it is part of the subtext of Bryce's world, even if it doesn't play out in any meaningful way. But they're there and they exist and they sort of sit in the background, but they're not fully part of the story. Now, there is also a triangle between Tom, our main character, our protagonist, Bryce and Pritchard, due to Bryce's desire to outsmart Senator Duval. So Tom's job is to find out what information Duval gets from the CIA that gives him a level of power within knowledge power. Now, this all starts out, so this triangle between those three characters all starts out very hunky-dory because it's a promotion and a higher profile for our hero, and it's all very good. But it does start to fall apart pretty quickly. And this is when Susan and Tom start a relationship. So this establishes another triangle between Susan, Tom, and Bryce. Now, this gives Susan and Tom internal conflict because they are in love, whereas Bryce's power over Susan is threatened. So the triangle creates tension in the story because we expect Bryce at some stage to find out that Susan has another lover, and we expect him to react somehow. And he does. He reacts by killing Susan. And it's just an accident, apparently. But anyway, we won't go into that. And when Bryce does react by killing Susan, it actually creates another conflict, or it escalates the conflict in other triangles. And all of the conflicts then start to overlap, and they create complications that escalate very quickly. And the result is that it puts Tom's life further and further at risk. Now, the conflict between the people in the triangle is the result of one person's object of desire changing and the realization of their stakes. And when I'm talking about this, I really do mean that triangle between Pritchard, Tom, and Bryce. So when Bryce kills Susan, he moves closer to losing his power because he's murdered someone. And it will become obvious, or the information will get out that he's become an adulterer, or that he has been an adulterer. Now, one of Bryce's conflict triangles has therefore tipped the balance so that all the others are now at risk. So it has escalated the stakes for all of the other triangles, relationship triangles in the story. Bryce's actions and the shift of his object of desire, so it's gone from gaining more power to maintaining his power by getting away with murder. This has created a shift in the conflict and in the other relationships that Bryce has. Now, Pritchard moves into action and starts to protect Bryce, to protect himself. And in doing this, the CIA notices changes in the Department of Defence's behaviour, which then raises their suspicions that something's going on. Pritchard and Bryce concoct the story about Susan being murdered by some Russian sleeper spy, which has a ghost spy, which everyone knows as Yuri. And this changes the dynamic for Tom in multiple ways. So Tom's object of desire changes from wanting Susan to himself to wanting Bryce to pay for her murder. Now, this places Tom directly at odds with Pritchard and Bryce. So where their relationship triangle before was all mutually beneficial, it has now upset the balance and put them all at conflict with one another. Now, this movie relies very heavily on dramatic irony, and this is where the audience knows more than some of the characters in the story. And in this case, we know that Tom was Susan's lover, and he is also the person that Bryce and Pritchard are trying to frame, not only for Susan's murder, but also to set him up as being the spy Yuri. Even though they're not aware of that, Bryce and Pritchard, we are aware because we have a fuller picture of what's going on. Now, for me, the use and manipulation of information in a spy movie is a convention of the genre. In Tom's case, his identity as Susan's lover is a piece of information that he doesn't want people to know. And when he does share it with Sam, we can see how dramatic irony and the relationship triangles are used consistently to create conflict and to build tension in the story. Sam is Tom's friend and colleague, and he knows that Tom is acting strangely. So when Tom tells Sam about his relationship with Susan, there's a sense of relief. And Sam starts to delay the electronic identification of Tom from a photograph. However, Sam confides in Pritchard because he doesn't believe Tom's assertion that Bryce and Pritchard are creating a scapegoat. Now, noting that Tom and Pritchard's objects of desire are opposed, we understand just at that point what Sam has done. So he has given Pritchard a piece of evidence that he needs to get Bryce off the hook, and he's also given over Tom as the scapegoat. So I think this is a really interesting way that the movie works, and how we know pieces of information and are putting that together, even if the characters don't know the same thing. We can see how that is revealed through the course of the movie. Now, another good example of information creating conflict between three characters is in the scene where Pritchard and Tom visit Susan's friend Nina. Now, the conflict is created by understanding what each character wants in this scene and what they have at stake, and understanding that each character is the other's force of antagonism. So, for example, Pritchard wants Nina to reveal the identity of Susan's secret boyfriend, and if she doesn't hand it over, he threatens her with deportation. Now, all of this is linked to Pritchard's greater object of desire, which is to protect Bryce. Tom, on the other hand, doesn't want Nina to reveal him as Susan's secret boyfriend because he doesn't want to be framed, and he wants Bryce to pay. Nina reveals that she knows Susan was Bryce's lover, and she reveals that to Pritchard, and she hides Tom's identity. So no matter what Nina does in this scene, she is going to put someone's life in danger, including her own. And again, dramatic irony works well in this scene because we know that Nina and Tom have met, and we also know that Pritchard wants that information. We also know that Tom and Nina can't communicate about what's going on. So the tension is created by a combination of dramatic irony and the obstacles that stop Tom and Nina from communicating. Now, I won't go into some of the other conflicts included in this movie, but it is worth noting that I've tracked the following types of conflict. So there's interpersonal conflict. So the personal relationships between characters, including Tom and Pritchard, who went to the Naval Academy together. So they're classmates, they have history, and there's also the romantic relationships. So it's an interesting observation of how all of that out of movie interpersonal relationships have been built or used in this particular story. There's also political conflict, which is represented by Bryce, Senator Duval, and their lackeys. There's the interagency conflict. So there's the CIA versus the Department of Defense versus the FBI. So all of these agencies fight for resources and control of information, and they all want to protect their sources. There's also the conflict of spying, which is a spy's want is always to avoid discovery. And when Tom is revealed as Yuri at the end of the film, this shines a different light on some of Tom's actions throughout the investigation. So on the other side of a spy not wanting to be captured, the fear that we see in the movie, or we think that Tom is actually experiencing in the movie, is the fear of a false accusation of being a spy. So that is a very difficult situation to get out of, with a whole lot of agencies who are really keen to pin that label on you and are working against you. So I thought that was really interesting, although you don't necessarily understand that until you get to the end of the film. That it looks like Tom's trying to avoid being labelled as a spy when really he is a spy, even if it's all fabricated. But, his want then is to avoid being discovered. And I thought that was very interesting, even if it wasn't necessarily extremely well executed at certain points. But anyway, it's worthwhile watching in terms of the conflict. Now, there's also the investigation into Susan's murder, and we see Tom trying to pervert the investigation. We see that Pritchard is trying to frame Yuri, or Tom, to protect Bryce. And then there's the poor Major who's just trying to execute his investigation. So there's a few things at stake here, and the main one there is Tom's life. And we have the hitmen or the black ops men who are there to assassinate whoever it is that Pritchard wants taken out at any particular time. And we also see those that Bryce's and Pritchard's careers are at stake with that investigation as well. And I mentioned this at the top of the episode. So there's the Phantom submarine that is used to instigate the conflict between Bryce and Duval, but it actually doesn't amount to very much in the movie. And I think that's disappointing. I think if you're going to actually put that in there, then something has to be realised later on. But anyway, it is a point. It's set up as the main point of conflict, even if it doesn't necessarily go anywhere. Now, No Way Out is very much a movie of its time, and it has its flaws. However, it does create effective conflict by clearly defining each character's wants and what's at stake. It then creates the forces of antagonism by pitting each character's wants against the others. Now, this would become dull quickly if there were only two characters in each scene who oppose one another. So what the writers did was use conflict triangles to keep the conflict dynamic and also maintain tension and to keep us guessing about what's going to happen. So yes, it has its flaws, but I found this a really fascinating way that conflict is built in this movie this week. So Valerie, how did you go with cast design?
It's really interesting to me that you and I have picked up on so many of the same things this week. I mean, I don't know why that surprises me. It happens a lot, but it's still fun when it happens. And when it comes to cast design, everything you've said about the conflict triangles is right on the money. One of the key concepts of cast design, and I learned this from Stephen Pressfield, is to keep the cast as small as possible and to connect them in such a way that they can't easily walk away from one another. Because if a character can just leave when the going gets tough, then they will. And then that's the end of your story, whether you wanted it to be or not. Now, within this smallest possible cast, you create triangular relationships between the characters. And the thing that connects them, the thing that forms a triangle, is their object of desire. Now, Melanie, you just said all of this. You just came at it from the angle of conflict, whereas I've learned it initially from the angle of character development, because it's the conflict between characters that bring out the traits in the protagonist. Oh, I love story theory. Okay, now, this is not a new idea to anybody, but I'm willing to bet that 99.9% of all of us have only ever applied it in one way, and that's to a love triangle. We all know what a love triangle is, and we all are used to seeing a love triangle as three people. But it could actually be, if you're writing a romance, if you've got the two lovers, then something has to pull to form the third part of that triangle in order to create conflict between the two lovers, right? It could be, for example, that one of the lovers is really dedicated to their career, and being in a relationship with this other person, it jeopardizes their career somehow. But anyway, it's the same concept of having a triangular relationship. It's that love triangle exists, their triangle exists everywhere. We're used to seeing it as a love triangle, but Melanie, as you've just very clearly stated, it works just as well in a movie like this. And in fact, it's preferable. It's a really great way to create interest in your story, because there's all these little pockets of conflict. And when you move one little thing, all of a sudden, it's like clockworks, right? You can't move one gear without all of the other gears moving. Oh, it's so good. Okay. When it comes to analyzing the cast design of No Way Out, as always, we got to start with the protagonist. And remember, the supporting cast exists to bring out the aspects of the protagonist's character. And ideally, it's not just any aspect. I mean, this is not random. What we want to do is bring out conflicting aspects or traits of the protagonist. This is how we dramatize the dimensions of a character. So we talk about wanting to avoid exposition. Now, I don't think you have to avoid exposition. It has its place, it has a function, and it can work really well in a story if you know how to use it. But you don't want to just tell the whole thing and say, well, Tom was a really big jerk to his girlfriend. I mean, that's boring. We want to see him be the really big jerk because it infuriates some of us among the audience. So that's sort of what the supporting cast is there. Susan's whole function is to show that side of Tom. No, I just want to take a little detour here because I've got a side note. As I have said many times in this season and elsewhere, Robert McKee defines a character dimension as a set of conflicting traits. And that's the whole thing I'm studying, right? However, something came up in our discussion last week on the Full Monty that, I mean, honestly, I should have just sort of piped in and talked about it then, but I didn't. I let it go because I think we were running late. But it's been bothering me all week, so I have to circle back to it. This idea of a dimension or a character with a dimension or a dimensional character, however we want to phrase it, this is an area that can get tangly really fast, and it can create complete confusion because we don't all have the same understanding of what a dimension is. Now, I'm sticking to Robert McKee's use of the term because it's his theory about character development that I'm studying right now. So, last week I highlighted the sets of conflicting traits within Gaz, played by Robert Carlyle. These are his dimensions as explained by Robert McKee. Now, Melanie, you commented last week that you think Dave, who's Gaz's, sidekick, his friend, you think that he's a much more dimensional character than Gaz. And you're not wrong, but you use the term dimension in a different way than I used it. And it's actually your use of the term that's a lot more common among writers. Dave's struggle is all about his self-esteem. It's internal. He's much more of an open wound than Gaz is, and he can seem like a much deeper character. So what I'm saying is that when a character's internal struggle is highlighted, and they don't seem so superficial, because Gaz does seem superficial, and this depth that we perceive as the reader or viewer, when we see that depth, we describe it as dimensional, right? We think a deep character is a dimensional character. And there's nothing wrong with explaining a character that way or thinking of a character that way, but it's a different use of the word. So in other words, McKee is using the word dimension as a noun, but most of us tend to use it as an adjective. And I just wanted to chat about that for a little bit and touch on last week so that we didn't leave any confusion out there, because I worry that it might have gotten confusing. Anyway, if it did get confusing, then hopefully this explains it a bit, helps clarify, the muddy waters. Anyway, it just highlights something that I keep saying over and over. When we're learning story theory, one of the hardest things about it is that one concept can be described a whole bunch of different ways, and one word can be used to describe a whole bunch of different things. So we will be doing ourselves a huge favor if we focus on the concept being discussed rather than the label on it. And that when we hear a term being used and it seems like it's being used in a different way than we understand it, still go by the concept being discussed and sort of let the label go, because there's no standards. All right, let's get back to No Way Out. I said that the supporting cast exists to highlight the set of conflicting traits within the protagonist. All right, so far so good, but here's the rub. Not all protagonists have conflicting traits. Not all characters have an internal shift or an arc, and they don't change. This is pretty common in action stories or thrillers or crime stories and what I call left-brained stories, because I don't know how else to describe them. And left-brained stories are any story where the focus is on figuring out a puzzle of some sort. So spy stories are left-brain stories. Mysteries are left-brain stories. They're about solving the puzzle, not seeing the arc of the character. So if the character doesn't arc and the character has no dimension, in other words, the protagonist is flat, then what function does the supporting cast serve? Well, it's very simple. They're plot devices. And this is the case with No Way Out. Commander Tom Farrell is a flat character. Yes, there is a twist at the end that he is, in fact, a Russian spy, but that twist isn't a character dimension. It's a twist. Like everything else in this movie, it's a plot device. Tom is an on-the-nose stereotype. I wonder if we thought of him as a stereotype in 87. I can't remember. I just accepted so much in 87. If I could go back and talk to my 17-year-old self, what a talking I'd give myself. Okay.
I think we were bedazzled by Kevin Costner, to be honest.
Oh, no. Speak for yourself.
I think he looks in this is his first big break movie. And I think this is the one that sort of launched his career. So, yeah, I think there was a lot of distraction, even if you may not have.
He's no Hugh Jackman, so. Let me just say that.
Okay.
But you're right. See, this is the same thing that some of the Marvel movies, where they have Chris Hemsworth's abs splashed all over the screen to distract us from the fact that the scenes aren't working. I have no problem with that. I just think they should leave the abs up there a little longer so all of the moms in the audience can enjoy the moment. That's the only problem I have with it. Yes, I'm objectifying him. He got paid a lot of money to be objectified. I am sure he's fine with it. All right. Anyway, so Tom Farrell is a flat character. Yes, there's the twist at the end, but it's a twist. And a twist like that, sir, having his true identity revealed, that's not a character dimension. That's a plot device. All right. That's an important distinction. Now, Melanie, I agree with your comment that this movie has not aged well. It was well received at the time, but holy moly, it's like a B movie now. Like it's bad. It's bad. And it doesn't stand up to one, multiple viewings, or two, a close first viewing. The plot holes, and yes, there's many of them, but then there's all these little glitchy things. I don't know what to call them. And they're pretty easy to spot. Like, for example, one of them is the problem with the whole Polaroid of Tom. In the photo, he's got his hands up, like by his head, like he's trying to shoo her away or say, "Don't take my picture," which is exactly what he's saying. But when Susan actually took the picture, Tom's hands weren't anywhere near his head. He was holding a pillow and it was down. So his hands were sort of like, down by his legs. And that's really glaring because when the picture comes up and his hands are by his head, I just thought, did I miss something? No, I didn't. It was glaring enough that it took me out of the movie for a while. And then I just kind of went with it. But I had to go back and check. Another glaring problem is when Tom arrives back home to his apartment and he speaks to the building manager about the painting that the manager is painting. And both of them are continuing to role play. And it makes no sense because they're the only two people in the room. The only other entity in the room is the camera, which is us. So for them to continue to role play the way they are means that they are aware of us in the room, which is stupid. That's all I have to say about that. But the bigger problem for me is that it's not playing fair with the audience. And I think that's poor storytelling. Now, the other thing I wanted to say about this movie is that it doesn't seem to know what kind of story it wants to be. Melanie, I feel like I'm just repeating everything you just said. It wouldn't surprise me to hear that partway into the filming of this, a brand new writer was brought in, because it feels like the whole storyline shifts, goes in a whole different direction. Now, I think that Tom always was supposed to be the spy, but I think the original idea was that he was there to steal the plans for the Phantom submarine. That's what's being set up, as you said, Melanie. And then all of a sudden, Susan's dead. And the submarine plot and all the characters that were introduced associated with that plot are gone. They're just, no one talks about it anymore. And those characters never reappear. And so now, as the movie exists, that whole submarine plot is a very elaborate way to explain why Tom is working for Bryce. It's, again, another device to get Tom into Bryce's office working as his aide. And if you ask me, that's a colossal waste of screen time. Just have him appointed as Bryce's aide. The whole reason he's there's a scene, it's probably 20 minutes in. It might even be close. It might even be close to 30 minutes or even 40 minutes, where Bryce says to Pritchard, you've got a friend, right, who's in the Navy, and he's really clever. Get him in the office. That's all we needed. And presto magico, the really clever friend shows up. Right? That would have just saved a whole lot of screen time. The other thing that confused me is I don't know exactly what's at stake for Tom if Bryce and Scott find out that he is one of Susan's boyfriends. Now, Melanie, when I was listening to you, I could have missed this. I watched it a couple of times, but I will admit my attention wandered. So I might have missed this. You might be right on this. I didn't get the sense that anyone really thought that Yuri was a real person. I also didn't get the sense that if and when Pritchard and Bryce saw that Tom was the one in the picture, that anyone would think Tom was this pretend Russian spy that no one really believed was in existence anyway. They would go, oh my God, Tom is the boyfriend. Tom, the military hero, not Tom, they wouldn't make the leap that Tom is now Yuri. So I didn't get it.
Oh, okay. So I think that's just one of those paranoia things, right, in intelligence agencies. So and I agree, it was a fabricate, there's this ghost spy of Yuri that they're trying to create this story that gets Bryce off. And I think it's not very well done or very well executed, but the fact then that Tom is Yuri at the end means that he wasn't a phantom.
See, that's the weird thing. Because when it's finally revealed that he is a Russian spy, I was kind of like, so what? Right? It would have been far more interesting if he had been set up as the murderer. The stakes were much higher. The way the movie is set up, Tom being found out as the boyfriend equals Tom as the murderer was a much more likely conclusion for the characters to come to. And it had high stakes, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because now he's the scapegoat. But Tom as the boyfriend equals Tom as the Russian spy. It was because the whole Phantom submarine plot evaporated, then the stakes around that part evaporated with it.
Yes. No,
so
I
that
agree.
When the big reveal comes that he actually is the Russian spy, it's so what? I might have bought it in 1987. I might have thought this was great. I can't remember.
I think I remember buying it and going, wow. In 90, I don't think I saw it in 87. I saw it a few years after that. But yes, I thought that was, it was a really, you're so engrossed in the action of it. And and again, in subsequent viewings, some of it just completely makes no sense.
But I think this is the beauty of the conflict triangles that you're talking about. Because
Yes.
that's what attracts our attention.
And that's
so
what it
all
does.
of these other little hiccupy things, we just go with it. We roll with it.
Yeah. Yeah. And in the first viewing, you are really caught up in just how interconnected that conflict is, and how, like you said, one thing shifts and everything kind of follows on and shifts. And I think that's why I chose this movie, not because it's a fantastic spy movie, but yeah, it keeps you engaged at that first viewing level until you, especially when it came out, because it was a novelty. Whereas now we're a bit more sophisticated in plots and a few other things. It doesn't present as big a puzzle as what it did when it first came out. But yeah.
And we watch a lot more movies now because we can watch them on our phone if we want.
Yeah.
Going to the movie in 1987 was a big deal, and you went and you watched it once, and then that's it. You couldn't see it anymore.
Yeah.
Until whenever
right.
VHS came out, whatever that was.
That's
Do you know
right.
what I mean? So this is something that's really important for us to remember, because it might have worked in the 80s or the 70s or even the 90s, but audience